The first thing Commander Sarah Natkov noticed about the Vethel ambassador was that it never blinked. She had spent 6 years reading alien body language by then, 6 years of field deployments, 4 formal contact events, 2 evacuations under fire, and she'd learned that the absence of a gesture mattered as much as any gesture made. The Vethal did not blink. They did not fidget. They stood absolutely still when they were watching you. And the ambassador was watching her now, from across the glass partition of the integration chamber, 3 lateral eyes tracking her with the quiet, comprehensive patience of a machine running a diagnostic. Not hostile, not curious, simply measuring. She had been measured before. She had learned not to show that it bothered her. "Ambassador Kethron," she said, keeping her voice even, keeping her hands loose at her sides. "I appreciate you agreeing to this session." The translator collar around the ambassador's neck, a device they had permitted, which was itself a concession the diplomatic corps had celebrated for 3 weeks, produced a flat, soft sound, like wind moving through hollow bone. "Collective is always interested in the behavior of the lesser tool-bearers," it said. "Your persistence merits observation." Lesser tool-bearers. That was what they called humanity. Not a slur, exactly. The Vethal did not possess the concept of a slur. They simply described. What they described, they meant with the precision of a surgeon, marking a line for incision. Sarah let the words settle, and did not let her jaw tighten. That was the first skill she had mastered. Not letting the jaw tighten. It had taken her 8 months. She pulled out the chair on her side of the partition, deliberately slow, deliberately ordinary, and sat down. Outside the integration facility, the Vethel fleet was still in orbit. 43 capital ships, each one roughly the size of a terrestrial mountain range laid on its side. They had emerged from FTL 11 months ago, decelerated, in perfect synchronized formation over the Terminator line of Earth's northern hemisphere, and opened a communications channel before any human targeting system had finished cycling up. The message had been 12 words. 12 words in a language no one had ever heard, accompanied by a translation package so complete and elegant that the lead xenolinguist at CERO had wept when she finished reading it. Not from joy, but from the sudden, hollow understanding of how long it must have taken them to compile it. They had been watching. For a long time they had been watching. The 12 words, translated, were, "We have determined that integration will be efficient. Prepare your leadership structure." That was 11 months ago. Since then, there had been 7 formal sessions, 3 collapsed negotiation rounds, 1 weapons discharge incident that the Vethel had absorbed without apparent damage, and then described afterward as within acceptable behavioral parameters for a nascent species under stress. The Secretary General had said something in response that her translator had rendered diplomatically. Sarah had seen the original transcript. It had not been diplomatic. She had been brought in after the 3rd collapsed negotiation round. File described her as a specialist in post-contact stabilization. What that meant in practice was that she was someone who could sit in a room with a being that did not blink and did not breathe in any rhythm she could detect and keep talking. She was good at talking. She had always been good at it. Her mother had told her that once, with the particular mix of admiration and warning that only mothers managed, sitting at the kitchen table in their apartment in Reykjavik, a cup of tea going cold at her elbow, watching 12-year-old Sarah argue her way out of a punishment she demonstrably deserved. "You'll talk your way into something you can't talk your way back out of someday," her mother had said. She hadn't been wrong. She also hadn't been entirely right. "I'd like to talk today about the resettlement proposal," Sarah said. "You have read the collective's terms. I've read them. You have objections. I have questions." The ambassador was still for a long moment. The Vethal went very still when they were thinking. Not the stillness of a person pausing, the stillness of something that had simply suspended all unnecessary process. Like a city during a power cut. Like a brain between heartbeats. "Questions," it said at last, as if testing the word structural integrity. "You are aware that the terms are not negotiable." "Everything is negotiable," Sarsa said. "That's something my species does very well." There was a longer pause this time. She watched the 3 lateral eyes. The 2 on the sides and the 1 recessed in the center of the brow ridge, slightly smaller and differently colored. and waited. She'd been told by the xenobiology team that the central eye was the primary social cognition. She'd been told not to look at it directly. She was looking at it directly. She'd been told a great deal of things she'd had to decide. One by one were wrong. Your species, the ambassador said, negotiates from sentiment. Partly, Sarah agreed. Sentiment is architecturally unstable. It produces inconsistent outcomes. It also produces outcomes that nobody expected, including us. She let that land. That's actually what I wanted to talk about. The integration facility was a converted research station on the edge of the shelf, chosen partly for its neutrality, partly because its isolation kept the press at a manageable distance, and partly, she suspected, because whoever had chosen it had wanted the cold to serve as a constant reminder of what was at stake. It was effective. Some nights, she could feel the weight of it through the walls. The dark, the ice, the sheer unglamorous hostility of the environment that humanity had chosen to build things in anyway. She found it steadying rather than oppressive. She'd grown up in Reykjavik. Cold was not the enemy. She slid a document across the table to the glass partition. A physical document, printed on paper, which the Vethel had noted with what she'd come to recognize as interest. They did not use physical media. They had not used physical media for a very long time. They found it, she thought, the way a very old and very sophisticated person might find a handwritten letter, somehow both primitive and oddly arresting. The resettlement terms as drafted require the relocation of approximately 340 million people from coastal and equatorial zones within 18 of ship cycles, she said. That's roughly one standard Earth year. I'd like to walk you through why that number is architecturally unstable. The timescale is calculated to minimize atmospheric disruption during the initial terraforming phase. I understand that, and I understand the collective's terraforming plans will likely produce better long-term conditions for human survival than our current trajectory. She paused. But the movement of 340 million people in 1 year will cause a cascading food distribution failure that your own models. She tapped the document. Project will result in approximately 12 million deaths in the first 8 months. The ambassador processed this. It did not look at the document. It did not need to. The collective's models show 12.4 million, it said. The number was considered within acceptable parameters for transitional integration. She had known it would say that. She had prepared for the moment of hearing it. She had sat with it, alone, in her room the night before, and let herself feel what it felt like, and then set it aside and decided what to do next. This was the second skill she had mastered, setting things aside without losing them. They went somewhere internal, those things. They accumulated. She had become, over 6 years, a very full person. I'd like to propose an alternative timeline, she said. The terms are not, I know, hear me out. She kept her voice entirely level. What the collective understands about human behavior is that we are inconsistent. We produce unexpected outcomes. We act from sentiment in ways that damage our own interests. She paused. What the collective may not have fully modeled is what happens to a species that loses 12 million people in 8 months due to a failure that was preventable and that its leadership agreed to. The ambient hum of the facility's climate systems filled the silence. Explain, the ambassador said. We grieve badly, Sarah said. We grieve together, and when we grieve together at scale, we become architecturally unpredictable. I have seen it. I have read the histories. Every major human conflict of the last 3 centuries can be traced to a point where a large group of people lost something they loved and were given no viable path through the loss except violence. She looked steadily at the center eye. You have 43 ships in orbit. I am not making a threat. I am making a prediction based on documented behavioral data, which I will submit in full if you would like to review it. My proposal is not to reject integration. My proposal is to slow the resettlement timeline by 18 months, restructure the food corridor agreements, and accept in exchange a 5-year acceleration of the technology transfer protocols you've been withholding pending compliance. The stillness that followed was different from the previous ones. She had learned to read the quality of the ambassador's stillness the way some people learn to read weather by watching how animals moved. This one had a particular texture. She thought of it as the stillness of something recalculating. You are offering, the ambassador said slowly, trade and acceleration of your own species' technological development, a thing the collective has been managing carefully to prevent destabilization for a slower integration timeline. Yes, this is counterproductive to your species' long-term independence. Yes, we know that, and yet you offer it. Because 12 million people won't die in 8 months, Sarah said simply. That matters more to us than the technology. That's the sentiment the collective keeps filing as an architectural weakness. I'm asking you to consider that it might also be a load-bearing wall. The ambassador was still for a very long time. Outside, through the narrow, frost-edged windows set high in the integration chamber wall, the Arctic sky had gone the particular shade of gray that preceded real darkness. Not night exactly, but the slow, thoughtful withdrawal of light that this latitude produced in late autumn. She had grown to love that light. It reminded her of the feeling of being between things, which was where she had lived for most of her adult life. She thought about her mother's kitchen. She thought about the tea going cold. She thought about the particular sensation of arguing for something you believed in, and not knowing, yet, whether it would work. The ambassador spoke. The collective will review the proposal. She kept her face neutral. This was the third skill, the one that had taken the longest, keeping her face neutral at the moment of a small victory. It mattered because she was not alone here. Behind the chamber's observation window, a team of 15 people, analysts, linguists, military advisors, 2 members of the Secretary General's office, were watching. The Vethal knew they were there. The Vethal, she had come to understand, always knew who was watching. Team behind the glass did not need to see, was her relief. Relief was contagious, and relief was premature. They needed to see steadiness. I appreciate the collective's willingness to review, she said. Shall we take a break before continuing? The break room at the research station had a coffee machine that had been broken for 6 of the 11 months of the contact event, had been repaired, and had broken again the previous Thursday. Someone had set up a camp stove on the counter beside it, and there was a battered, aluminum kettle that people used in shifts. The room smelled permanently of instant coffee and machine oil, and the particular kind of exhaustion that accumulates in people doing important work under conditions of persistent uncertainty. Colleague Dmitri was standing by the kettle when she came in, watching it boil with the patient intensity of a man who had transferred all of his anxieties onto a small source of heat. He was 41, ex-military intelligence, spoke 7 languages, and had a habit of humming under his breath when he was worried. He was humming now. She recognized the tune, some half-remembered folk song she couldn't place, something with a repetitive, looping structure that felt old. How'd it go? He said without turning around. They're reviewing the timeline proposal. He turned around. His face did the thing she'd learned to read. The careful reorganization that meant he was deciding how much hope to let himself feel.
Viewing or dismissing?
Reviewing. The center eye went still for almost 4 minutes. That's longer than any previous processing pause. Something. He poured water into 2 mugs. Anything on the food corridor restructure? Not yet. I didn't push it past the first point of resistance. 1 concession at a time. She accepted the mug. The tea was too strong and tasted faintly of the kettle's previous contents. She didn't care. They said again that the terms are non-negotiable. They always say that. They always say that, she agreed. He handed her the mug and leaned against the counter. He was someone she'd worked beside long enough that they had stopped needing to narrate everything. The silence between them was a working silence, companionable and efficient, the kind that only existed between people who had been frightened together enough times that the shared fear had compressed into a kind of shorthand. She trusted him with her back and with her second guessing. And those were the 2 things she trusted anyone with. Mira flagged something from the overnight communications intercept, he said. Subchannel 17. The one we think is the internal administrative frequency. They mentioned you by designation. She looked at him. Not by name. They don't use names. By function. The designation they've been using for you. He hesitated. Our best translation is something like the persistent one who speaks for the dead. She was quiet for a moment. The kettle made a small sound, settling. That's not necessarily negative, she said. No, he agreed. But it's not neutral either. They don't usually assign designations to individual human operatives. They track functions, not individuals. The fact that you've been individuated enough to get a designation means something. She looked at the window. Outside, the research station's perimeter lights were coming on against the early dark orange cones of light in the gray. It means they've started taking me seriously enough to be concerned. Either way, it's data. Dmitri hummed a few notes of the folk song again. Absently, she finally placed it. It was something her mother used to sing. Not the same tune, but the same family of tune. Something from that particular tradition of songs that were designed to be sung while doing other things, while working or walking or waiting. She didn't say this. Get some sleep tonight, he said. Tomorrow's session is on the extraction protocols and those are going to be uglier. I know, Sarah. He waited until she looked at him. You did good in there. She nodded once. She took her tea and went back to her room. The designation that the Vethal had assigned her was a more complex thing than Dimitri's translation had rendered. She knew this because she'd accessed the xenolinguistics team's raw notes at 2 in the morning, sitting at the small desk in her quarters with the heating unit ticking beside her, and the sound of the wind moving against the facility's outer walls. The root word in the designation, the one they'd translated as persistent, was also the root word for a Vethal concept that had no clean human analog. Something like the structural property of a material that deformed under pressure but did not break. Resilience was close but too simple. They had a word for the quality of a thing that could be bent almost to its limit and then spring back into exactly its original shape. She sat with that for a while. The other word, speaks for the dead, was more straightforward in the Vethal lexicon, but more layered in its implication. The collective did not maintain memory of individual deaths. Their demographic data was aggregate, numbers, distributions, projected timelines. The concept of speaking specifically on behalf of people who had not yet died, but would, based on policy decisions. This was apparently unfamiliar enough to merit a designation. They had categorized it. They had given it a function title. The function title had been assigned to her personally. She found this both unsettling and useful. The unsettling part she set aside. The useful part she turned over in her mind, examining its edges. They understood that she was arguing for people who did not exist yet in any meaningful sense, people who were currently alive but would be dead under one scenario and alive under another, depending on what happened in that room. The Vethats a concept for this kind of argument. They had a word for it. That meant it was not entirely outside the frame of what they could process. That was a door, if she could figure out where it led. She got very little sleep. The morning session began badly. Not dramatically badly, no shouting, no walkouts. Nothing that would register on a security alert. The Fail did not shout. They simply became more literal, more precise, more aggressively comprehensive in their framing of her objections as procedural anomalies rather than legitimate inputs. It was a technique she recognized now. When the collective was resistant to a direction, they didn't push back directly. They narrowed the frame until the direction in question became definitionally impossible. They were very good at it. They had presumably been doing it for a very long time. The morning's agenda was the extraction protocols, the Vethal term for what the human diplomatic corps had been calling resource allocation, which was what the Secretary General's office called the thing where they take the minerals. The Vethal intended to begin deep crust extraction in 17 sites on 4 continents within the first year of integration. The human negotiating team had spent 8 months trying to limit this to 6 sites with environmental oversight provisions. The Vethal had agreed to the oversight provisions Sira had eventually concluded was because they had no meaning to a species that simply could not conceive of why a planet's geological structure would be considered a stakeholder in anything. She let the ambassador work through its prepared positions for 40 minutes before she spoke. I'd like to set aside the site count for a moment, she said. The site count is central to, I know, I'll come back to it. She set her hands flat on the table. I want to ask you something outside the current agenda. The ambassador was still. The designation the collective has assigned to my function, she said. I've been reviewing the raw linguistic data overnight. I'd like to understand the full Vethiol concept behind the first term, the quality of structural deformation without fracture. If an alien without a human face could be said to look surprised, the ambassador came as close to it as she had ever seen. The center eye adjusted. A very small movement, barely perceptible. She had been watching for it. You read our linguistic data, it said. I had access to the xenolinguistics files. I studied them overnight. Was a pause of a different quality from any she had catalogued. Shorter than calculation, longer than dismissal. She thought it might be something adjacent to attention. The concept you are referencing, the ambassador said slowly, describes a category of structural integrity considered highly valuable in load-bearing materials, a thing that can absorb extraordinary force without catastrophic failure. It is rare. Most materials that can withstand high force are brittle. Deformation without fracture requires a specific internal architecture. And you applied that term to my function. The collective applied it to the function you perform. The function of sustained resistance under compressive force, without collapse. Why does the collective have a word for that? The ambassador paused again. Because we encounter it rarely enough that it merits designation when it occurs. She held that for a moment. Outside, the Arctic light was doing its oblique morning thing. Low and long, and full of shadows, and she was aware of the weight of the 43 ships in orbit, the weight of the 11 months of sessions, the weight of the 340 million people who would move or would not move, the weight of the 12 million who would die or would not die, and beneath all of that, lower and older, the weight of a kitchen table in Reykjavik and a cup of tea, and her mother's particular expression watching her argue. She thought about what her mother had told her. That she'd talk her way into something she couldn't talk her way back out of. She thought about how that had always felt like a warning, and how she had spent years not being sure whether it was actually a warning or actually a of something her mother, despite herself, admired. She looked at the center eye. I would like to make an argument, she said, that the collective integration model is architecturally suboptimal because it does not account for the properties it has just described. The ambassador was perfectly still. You are proposing, it said, that the quality of sustained resistance without collapse is something the collective should be preserving, rather than minimizing. I'm proposing that a species the collective itself has designated as possessing that property is more valuable in full structural integrity than in a modified compliant form. She kept her voice measured. She was aware that what she was doing was unusual. She was not making a political argument. She was not making a humanitarian argument. She was making an engineering argument, in the collective's own language, about the instrumental value of human stubbornness. You've identified something in human behavior that you don't often encounter. You gave it a name. I'm asking you what that name is worth to you. The session that followed lasted 6 hours. She did not win everything. She did not expect to. She got the resettlement timeline extended by 14 months. 2 months short of her ask, which meant it was probably the real limit and not a negotiating position. She got 3 of the extraction sites reduced in scope. Food corridors were tabled for the following session, but the collective. This was the word the ambassador used. The collective, not the ambassador alone, agreed to commission a full mortality projection review with human demographic input. That had never happened before. That was a thing that had not existed before today. When she walked out of the chamber, Dmitri was standing in the corridor. He had his hands in his pockets, and his expression was doing the careful reorganization again. The mortality projection review, he said. Yes. He stopped. That's significant. It's one step. Still, she was tired in the particular deep way that came from 6 hours of sustained precision under pressure. A tiredness that went further down than muscle. She also something else. Something she didn't have a clean word for. Not triumph. Triumph was too clean and too final. And this was neither clean nor final. Something more like the feeling of a joint that had been under load for a long time and had held. Get some sleep, she said, reversing his instruction from the night before. He laughed. It was a short, compressed sound, the laugh of someone who hadn't expected to laugh. It was, she thought, a completely human sound. There were flowers delivered to the facility the next morning, not from the Veth-Al. The Veth-Al did not understand flowers in any register that would have produced such a gesture. They were from the Secretary General's office. A formal arrangement of something expensive and hothouse grown, orange and red and slightly too perfect. The attached card read, "Outstanding progress. The SG office thanks you." She set the arrangement on the windowsill of her quarters, where the Arctic light hit it sideways, and turned the flowers into something she liked. Better, less formal, more actual. The card she put in her desk drawer. She had a collection of such cards. She didn't know why she kept them. Some impulse toward documentation that she'd never bothered to examine. The morning session was the food corridor restructure. The afternoon was a review of the technology transfer acceleration she'd offered 2 days ago and the collective's preliminary response. Both were difficult. Both moved. At the end of the afternoon session, the ambassador said something to her that wasn't in any prepared position or on any documented agenda. "The collective has reviewed the behavioral data you submitted," it said. "The historical documentation of human collective grief responses." She waited. "The collective finds the data." The ambassador paused, and she had the sense that it was searching for a word, which she had never observed it do before. "Instructive. Not in the sense we had previously considered. We had previously modeled human grief as an inefficiency in decision-making architecture. The data you submitted suggests it also functions as a binding mechanism in social structures under external stress. A cohesive force." She kept her face neutral. Her jaw did not tighten. Her expression revealed nothing. "The collective's position," the ambassador continued, "is that the initial integration model may have underweighted cohesion as a structural variable." "That seems like a reasonable conclusion," she said. "Your proposed timeline adjustment is provisionally incorporated into the current integration framework," she said. "Appreciate the collective's willingness to revise." What she did not say, what she kept entirely internal and set aside for later, everything else. The 6 years of it. The 8 months of learning not to let the jaw tighten. The nights in the converted research station, listening to the wind. The cup of tea going cold in Reykjavik. The folk song that Dmitri hummed without knowing he was humming it. The tune that lived in the same family as the tunes her mother had sung while doing other things. The 12.4 million people who were now a different number, in a different column, because an argument had gone the right way. She did not say any of it. She filed it. The final session of the week was short, administrative, confirmatory, nothing that required her specific skills. She used the time to walk the perimeter of the research station in the afternoon, something she did when she needed to clear the accumulated residue of sustained precision. The cold was absolute, and the ground was frozen, solid, and the low sun cast her shadow long across the ice, in a way that always struck her as slightly comic. This elongated, exaggerated version of herself projected across the landscape. She thought about the designation the collective had given her. She thought about it without trying to resolve it, just letting it turn in her mind like an object being examined in low light. Persistent, speaks for the dead. Deformation without fracture. She thought about what her mother had said, and whether it was a warning, and whether it mattered. There was a communication waiting when she got back inside. Not from the Secretary General's office this time. From the collective's administrative channel. Formal, brief, notated with the compression codes that indicated it was from a higher tier of the collective structure than she'd previously been in contact with. The xenolinguistics team had already run a preliminary parse. The designation she'd been given had been updated. The new designation translated, provisionally and with caveats, as something like, "The one who argues with understanding of what will break." She read it twice. Then she put it down on her desk and went to make tea on the camp stove in the break room. Because the coffee machine was still broken, and because the tea, too strong and slightly metallic, was what existed and what she had learned, for 6 years and 4 contact events and 2 evacuations under fire, and 11 months of sessions in a converted Arctic research station with a being that never blinked to make work. Dmitri was there. He was humming. She listened to the tune for a moment, standing by the kettle, before she placed it. It was the same song her mother had sung at the kitchen table all those years ago, the looping, patient thing designed to be sung while doing other things, while working, while waiting. "Where did you learn that song?" she asked. He stopped humming and thought about it. "My grandmother," he said. "I don't know what it's called. She just sang it around the house. It was one of those things she did without thinking." She nodded. She watched the kettle. "The collective updated my designation," she said. "Yeah, I saw the message come in. What does it say?" she told him. He was quiet for a moment. The kettle began to make the preliminary sounds of approaching boil. "That's better than the last one," he said. "It's more accurate," she said. She picked up the kettle before it reached full boil. She preferred it that way, slightly under. She had her preferences, and poured the water into 2 mugs. She handed him one. He accepted it without comment because they had been doing this long enough that commentary was no longer required. Stood by the window in the break room and drank their tea. While the Arctic dark came in outside, and the perimeter lights came on, and the long, oblique shadows of the research station stretched across the ice. Above them, though she couldn't see it, though no one in the facility could see it, though it was as invisible and as present as weather, the collective's 43 ships moved in their slow orbital pattern, waiting, calculating, running their models, revising their frameworks, perhaps even now updating some internal category that had previously filed human behavior as an architectural inefficiency and was in the process of reclassifying it as something more load-bearing than that. She drank her tea. She thought about the morning session and what arguments she would need for it. She thought about the food corridors and the technology transfer timeline and the 14 months she'd gotten instead of 16, and how 14 was not 16 but was also not 0, and how the distance between 0 and 14, measured in people, was a number she was not ready to think about yet, but would think about eventually, at 2 in the morning, in her quarters, with the heating unit ticking. She thought about her mother. She let herself do that briefly, which was a thing she rationed carefully, not because the thought was painful, though it was sometimes, but because it was the truest reference point she had for what she was trying to do and why. And true for reference points required care. Her mother had been right that she would talk her way into something she couldn't talk her way back out. This was that something. She was in it. She had been in it for 6 years. And she would be in it probably for a long time yet. The Vethal were not going anywhere. Neither was the Earth. Neither, for that matter, was she. What her mother had not perhaps fully accounted for. What no one had entirely accounted for, not the Secretary General's office, diplomatic corps, not xenolinguistics team, or the military advisors, or the analysts behind the observation window, was that not being able to talk your way back out of something was only a problem if you wanted to. She set the empty mug down on the counter. She said good night to Dmitri. She went to her room to sleep 3 hours before her alarm, and she slept deeply. The people sleep well. They have been under compressive force for a very long time, and have not fractured, and have held, and know that tomorrow they will hold again. Outside, the wind moved across the Arctic ice, indifferent and very old. Perimeter lights burned orange in the dark, and 43 alien ships crossed and recrossed their slow arcs above a planet that was still, now in the middle of being decided. It was not decided yet. That was the point. That was always the point. It was not decided yet, which meant there was still a morning session, still an argument to be made, still a room to walk into, and a chair to pull out slowly and deliberately, and a voice to keep level, and a jaw to keep from tightening, and 12.4 million people in the collective's model to turn into a different number. In a different column, one careful session at a time. Sarah Natkov slept. The wind moved. The ships crossed their arcs. And somewhere in the collective's vast, patient administrative architecture, in the tier above the one that had spoken to her today, something was processing a designate it had not previously had a category for, a being that understood what would break, that argued from that understanding, that was made of the particular material that bends almost to the limit and then returns to its exact original shape, again and again and again and again, until the material on the other side of the load changes its own structure to accommodate it. It had been a very long time since the collective had encountered that material. It did not yet have a word for what that meant. It was beginning to look for one.